Good morning, and welcome to day 123 of F260 at First Baptist Meridian. Today we look at Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, as well as chapters 36 and 37. And in the opening verses of the prophet Ezekiel, we hear that in the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, while I was among the exiles by the Kabar Canal, or your translation may say the river Kabar, the heavens were opened and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's exile, the word of the Lord came directly to the priest Ezekiel, son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the Kabar Canal. And the Lord's hand was on him there. So one of the most interesting things about Ezekiel is, again, here's a guy whose identity was shaped from birth. He was born to a priestly family, and had he been in Jerusalem in the 30th year, as the text leads off, he would have begun his priestly ministry at this time. But he's not in Jerusalem. Ezekiel is part of the second wave of deportees from Jerusalem to Babylon that occurs probably around the year 597. And so he's not in the place where he thinks he should be, and he's not doing the thing that he thinks he should be doing, the very reason for his life. Instead, he's by the river Kabar. And yet it's precisely when he's separated from all those other sources of identity and purpose that God's hand is on him, that God speaks to him, that the heavens are open to reveal these fantastic visions to Ezekiel. And chapter 1 goes on to shape this beautiful and very complicated vision of this map upon which God's throne sits. But God's throne doesn't just have feet, it has wheels on the bottom, showing that God is not limited to Jerusalem. His sovereignty can move all over the map, anywhere the Spirit wills. Yes, in Jerusalem, but also in Babylon. And it's another way of reiterating that exile will not be the end of the story for God's people. God's authority is not destroyed just because the temple will be. And so I think it's interesting when you get to Ezekiel 36 and 37, Ezekiel, much like Jeremiah, told a lot about the forthcoming judgment on God's people. In 36 and 37, that message moves to restoration. And one of the primary signs of the restoration of God's people is the imagery of resurrection. You see this especially in chapter 37. By the way, notice how much, like we've talked in the past, you see appeals to a Davidic descendant to shepherd God's people, etc. But in chapter 37, Ezekiel is taken to the valley of dry bones. These things aren't just dead, they're good and dead. You know, the corpse is fully decayed. It's as dead as it can possibly be. And yet God calls Ezekiel to speak to the dry bones, to reassemble, to reanimate, to be renewed as a living thing. And this is God's way of saying, I know that my people are going into exile. I know that they're going to be punished for violating the covenant. I know that they feel dead and cut off from me. But even at their most dead, they are not beyond my power and they are not beyond my purpose. And so resurrection becomes the symbol and becomes the image for restoration, the return and the fulfillment of the covenant purposes for which God called his people. Why is that so important? Because we're getting close to moving into the New Testament, the life and ministry of Jesus. Jesus fully embodies both the message and the ministry of God himself to his people. He not only does God's things, he says God's things. And what do? They crucify him for it. But how does God respond to the greatest evil that mankind has ever done? He does not let Jesus see decay in the tomb. Rather, he resurrects him. So the resurrection of Jesus, what Paul calls the first fruits of the resurrection, is a larger symbol. It functions beyond itself. It shows God's purposes, God's plans, God's desires for all of those who call upon the name of the Lord to be saved. It's not just that God resurrected Jesus, it's that Jesus becomes the hope and the guarantee that God will likewise resurrect us. And so I think it's so interesting for me that Ezekiel, who is so cut off from everything he's supposed to be doing, Ezekiel, who thinks that he's had his very reason for being nullified by the exile, gets such a beautiful, direct, crystal clear window into how God will move not only in his own time, but ultimately in the time of Jesus and beyond through his people, the church. Keep reading, keep reflecting, and keep responding, and I'll see you tomorrow. God bless.